Edward Plantagenet, known to history as King Edward IV of England, entered the world on April 28, 1442. At the time of Edward's birth, his father, Duke Richard of York, was in command of the English military operations in Normandy, representing King Henry VI. Edward spent his initial 3 years in his parents' opulent residence in Rouen. His elder sister Anne, younger brother Edmund, and younger sister Elizabeth also resided there. Of the 7 children born to Duchess Cecily between 1446 and 1455, only 3 survived beyond infancy: Margaret and Edward's more renowned younger brothers, George and Richard. In 1444, less than a year after Elizabeth's arrival, the family relocated from Rouen back to England, establishing their home at Fotheringhay Castle in Northamptonshire. His estimated yearly income amounted to approximately $7,000, which translates to about £4.3 million in contemporary currency. While precise details regarding Edward's formative years and early schooling are scarce, substantial inferences can be drawn from historical documents dating from his reign. These include the educational guidelines Edward set for his own sons, and general knowledge regarding child-rearing and educational norms within the English aristocracy during the 15th century. Duchess Cecily may have personally overseen aspects of her children's initial education, such as religious and basic literacy instruction. However, Cecily was almost constantly occupied with childbirth until her eldest children, including Edward, were well into adolescence. Furthermore, as Duchess of York and mistress of vast estates, she likely relied more on nurses, especially if her time was limited in attending to her children's daily needs and early learning herself. This scenario seems probable, as Edward is said to have developed a strong connection with his childhood nurse in Normandy, Anne of Caux. He often spoke fondly of his early childhood under her care. Later in his reign, he granted her a yearly pension of $20. Around the age of 6 or 7, Edward and Edmund were sent to reside at Ludlow Castle under the supervision of a governor or male guardian and began their studies with a live-in private tutor. All the York sons studied Latin and French, later demonstrating considerable skill in both languages. Their curriculum also likely included arithmetic, history, and literature, alongside music, dance, and social etiquette, all considered essential attributes for courtly life. They underwent extensive military training encompassing riding, swordsmanship, and jousting. These martial skills would have been mastered while the boys were fully armored, adding another dimension to the required expertise. Military strategy and tactics may also have been incorporated into their history lessons or military drills, as Edward later exhibited consistent success and a natural aptitude for battlefield command. Edward probably also received instruction in property law and estate administration, potentially indicating that the Duke of York had not yet contemplated seizing the throne for himself or his eldest son until the late 1450s. Estate management was more pertinent for a nobleman than a king, and this training could account for Edward's notably active personal involvement in law, justice, and royal finances during his reign, an uncommon trait among medieval monarchs. As a young man, Edward was recognized for his charm, charisma, and keen intellect. Yet despite his refined education, Edward was not inclined towards academic or intellectual pursuits. He enjoyed reading and commissioning printed and exquisitely illuminated books, bound in silk and velvet for his personal library, a significant portion of which has survived to this day. Edward's personal reading preferences leaned heavily towards chivalric romances and popular histories of great figures, heroic deeds, and triumphant battles, primarily in French and English, which he read for personal enjoyment. Conversely, he possessed few texts in Latin, the language of European intellectual discourse, and displayed limited interest in the burgeoning humanist philosophies or other notably scholarly endeavors. Edward naturally possessed several religious texts, but he does not appear to have been particularly devout in his religious beliefs. His mother, Cecily Neville, was known as a deeply pious woman, with a strong scholarly interest in the writings of female Christian mystics like Bridget of Sweden and Catherine of Siena. However, Edward seems not to have fully absorbed the intellectual currents of the era, nor his mother's renowned piety, consistently prioritizing more worldly pursuits. Contemporaries described him as highly capable, cheerful, gallant, and generous, possessing a pleasant and even-tempered nature. Edward was well-liked for his affable, engaging demeanor and his capacity to be at ease in any social setting, an uncommon trait for young men raised with royal expectations, which of course Edward was not. He was also exceptionally bold and self-assured, even to the point of vanity regarding both his abilities and the Plantagenet handsomeness he had inherited. Numerous observers and chroniclers commented on Edward's exceptional physical attractiveness. The most recognized portrait of Edward IV, hanging in London's National Portrait Gallery, depicts a somewhat weary middle-aged man carrying some extra weight with dark brown hair and light brown eyes. However, this portrait was painted around 1540, almost 60 years after Edward's death. Contemporary documentary evidence does suggest that Edward gained considerable weight as he approached middle age, likely due to his considerable fondness for fine wine and food. When Edward's tomb at Windsor was opened in 1789, visitors reportedly departed with locks of his hair. Several such swatches and strands of brown hair, purported to be Edward's, have been auctioned in recent years. However, it is now understood that some of Edward's siblings had fair hair and blue eyes, and he himself reportedly fathered several fair-haired or red-haired children. It is therefore plausible that Edward was born with blonde or reddish-blonde hair, which darkened with age, and that he may have had lighter eye color than his portraits indicate. In his youth, the tall, handsome, charming, and energetic Edward must have presented a striking figure on horseback. Unsurprisingly, Edward's appreciation for female companionship was a prominent characteristic, as evidenced by his behavior throughout his romantic life, even after marriage. Had fate not intervened, Edward would almost certainly have lived a predictable life as the fourth Duke of York. He would have willingly served the king, inherited the majority of his father's estates, married, fathered children, and likely maintained several mistresses and their illegitimate offspring until his death. However, destiny cast him as the eldest son of a family with a legitimate claim to the English throne, in a nation where royal succession was dangerously ambiguous. This instability was compounded by the perceived weakness of the reigning monarch, Henry VI. Henry's fragile health and disinclination to govern in the traditional style of medieval warrior kings compelled the nobles surrounding him to wield power in his stead. The expanding influence of the king's select favored ministers bred rivalry and animosity among other influential members of the English aristocracy. Consequently, almost from the outset, Edward's life and purpose became dedicated to the advancement, and indeed the very survival of his lineage. Through his mother, Duke Richard of York was the rightful great-grandson of Lionel of Antwerp, first Duke of Clarence, the second surviving son of the last undisputed King of England, Edward III. Through his father, Richard also descended from Edward III's fourth surviving son, Edmund, first Duke of York. Edward III's eldest son, also named Edward and known as the Black Prince, had only one male heir, Richard II, who himself died childless. The Yorks later asserted that the rightful male heir to the throne following Richard II's death was, in fact, the one-year-old infant Roger Mortimer, grandson of Lionel and grandfather to Richard, Duke of York. The Duke would increasingly emphasize this ancestral line by 1460, when the crown seemed within reach. Up to that point, Richard Plantagenet had been contented to highlight his lineage solely from the first Duke of York. This was primarily due to two factors. Firstly, Richard's Mortimer ancestry derived from his mother, not his father, which diluted inheritance claims in a society favoring paternal lines. Furthermore, Lionel, Duke of Clarence, had no sons, only a daughter, Philippa, whereas John of Gaunt, Edward III's third surviving son, had fathered a legitimate son, Henry Bolingbroke. Intriguingly, despite the centuries-long dominance of primogeniture in English inheritance law, Edward IV was not the first English king to claim the throne based on inheritance through a female ancestor, nor would he be the last. Most medieval monarchs were fortunate to have just an heir and a spare. During the reigns of Edward III and his numerous sons, there was little indication of the upheaval into which their increasingly numerous descendants would descend. Overlapping with the Hundred Years' War with France, this roughly century-long period of intense rivalry for the English throne has become known as the Wars of the Roses, named after the emblems adopted by the opposing branches of the royal family, the White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster. Tensions between the ruling House of Lancaster and the House of York escalated during the late 1440s and 1450s. Edward's father, Richard, frequently found himself marginalized in favor of the Lancastrian Dukes of Suffolk and Somerset. These figures not only held the king's confidence, but also received appointments and privileges denied to the Duke of York. In 1446, the Duke of York's command position in Rouen was reassigned to Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset. an event seen by some historians as the genesis of the animosity between York and Lancaster. Compounding this situation, by the 1450s, the crown was deeply indebted to the Duke of York, owing him nearly $100,000. Approximately 20% of this debt consisted of unpaid loans the Duke had extended to the crown, but the majority represented unpaid wages for the Duke's extensive service in France. Concurrently, the king's Lancastrian ministers routinely received repayment of loans made to the crown, including interest. The increasingly precarious state of England's economy by the early 1450s ignited rebellion in Kent, in southeastern England. Rebels under the leadership of the Irishman Jack Cade demanded the removal of the king's evil, avaricious, and prodigal advisors, advocating for greater representation of men of good and noble birth. The Dukes of York, Exeter, Norfolk, and Buckingham were the names most prominently championed by the rebels. Naturally, the Lancastrians suspected York of instigating the uprising to further his own ambitions, especially as Jack Cade adopted the alias John Mortimer during the rebellion, aligning himself with the Duke's perceived legitimacy as a prince of the blood. However, it should not be inferred that the English populace would endorse Henry's deposition in favor of the Duke, a reality that Richard Plantagenet would eventually learn, to his own cost. King Henry's reign had begun in infancy. Subsequently, his disinclination towards governance and his assignment of responsibility for the French territories to his favored Lancastrian associates ultimately led to the loss of all French possessions secured by his father, Henry IV, except for Calais. This situation fueled widespread discontent with the king's Lancastrian advisors and the monarch himself. Many in England viewed with resentment the numerous decades, vast financial resources, and countless lives that appeared to have been squandered in conquering France, only to see almost all gains reversed due to the incompetence of the king and his closest ministers. When Henry VI began experiencing episodes of mental instability during the 1450s, the Duke of York was twice appointed Lord Protector during the king's periods of incapacity. Parliament and many of York's contemporaries viewed with suspicion the prospect of a regency controlled by King Henry's queen, Margaret of Anjou. Queens of England frequently encountered such suspicion from the English people because they were often of foreign origin. Foreign individuals at court were perpetually suspected of espionage, and queens who attempted to wield authority were invariably accused of improperly seizing royal prerogatives. In truth, any action taken by Queen Margaret to bolster her husband's throne or her son's inheritance was likely to be met with hostility by the leading men of the kingdom. Margaret observed the growing Yorkist movement with apprehension and a strong resolve to defeat the man who seemed determined to usurp her own son's position as heir to the throne. Noble families, similarly dissatisfied with the influence of Queen Margaret and the king's Lancastrian ministers at court, aligned themselves with the Yorkist cause, notably Duchess Cecily's family, the influential Northern Neville lineage, represented by her brother Richard, Earl of Salisbury, and his exceptionally charismatic son, also named Richard, Earl of Warwick. As the Yorkist faction primarily cultivated support in London and the southeast of England, and established external strongholds in France and Ireland as effective launchpads for invasion, Queen Margaret endeavored to gather support within the Lancastrian heartlands in the Midlands. The initial Battle of St. Albans in May 1455 was essentially a minor clash, yet it propelled the English nation onto a trajectory of internal conflicts that would result in the crown changing hands no fewer than 6 times in the subsequent 3 decades. The origins of this civil war in England, which unfolded over approximately 15 years, encompassed nearly all of Edward's childhood. He was most probably at Ludlow Castle in 1452, witnessing the Duke of Somerset presiding over the trials of those who had served Edward's father and participated in an attempted coup, following which the Duke of York had sought refuge in Ireland. At the age of 11, Edward accompanied his father to London in his capacity as Lord Protector to inaugurate Parliament, where Edward was officially recognized for the first time as the Earl of March and his father's heir apparent. At the age of 12, he purportedly commanded a force of 10,000 men from Ludlow in a march towards London with the intention of liberating his father from imprisonment. The Yorkist advance was swiftly communicated, and the Duke was released before their arrival. As the Lancastrian and Yorkist factions moved ever closer to outright warfare, Edward and his younger brother Edmund became increasingly involved in political matters and military preparations, and were already expected to assume leadership roles. A letter composed in June 1454 from the two boys to their father reassured the Duke that Edward and Edmund were diligently pursuing their studies and their military training. "We trust in God," the boys wrote, "that your gracious lordship and good fatherhood will be pleased." Following the First Battle of St. Albans in 1455, the recovered Henry III, who prioritized peace above all, sought to reconcile the leading men of England and bring an end to the factional strife. But the ensuing 4 years were nonetheless marked by overt animosity at court and the augmentation of armed retinues by both the Lancastrians and the Yorkists. In June of 1459, a meeting of the Great Council was convened at Coventry, from which no member of the York faction was invited. The Lancastrian attendees concluded the meeting with legal indictments for the Duke of York and his associates, who immediately mobilized to march in force on the capital. Their intention was to attempt a peaceful resolution with the king, who shared the same desire. However, the Queen's Lancastrian forces intercepted the Earl of Salisbury's forces at Ludford Bridge. Following this confrontation, the Yorks were declared guilty of treason by attainder, effectively forcing them into open rebellion. After the defeat at Ludford in October 1459, Edward's family and supporters became separated as each fled the country. The Duke of York sought refuge in Ireland with his son Edmund, Earl of Rutland, while Duchess Cecily and her younger children were taken into the custody of King Henry. They were, however, exempted from the attainder and treated with kindness and generosity. Meanwhile, Edward sought shelter with his uncle Salisbury and his cousin Warwick in Devon. Subsequently, they secretly journeyed to Calais. Warwick had been appointed captain of Calais during the Duke of York's second tenure as protector, and owing to Warwick's charisma and his proficiency in diplomacy and public relations, this final English stronghold in France was well fortified with Yorkist supporters and sympathizers. Duke Richard likewise cultivated support for the Yorkist cause among the Irish earls, and within 6 months the York faction was able to stage a successful invasion of England from both Ireland and France. Prior to the invasion, the Earl of Warwick spearheaded an extensive public relations campaign to clarify the rebels' objectives. He authored numerous letters and dispatched them to all regions of England. He also composed a manifesto to which he, Edward, and their respective fathers, the Dukes of Salisbury and York, all appended their signatures. The manifesto assured the people of England that the York faction were solely interested in eradicating corruption and restoring order and effective governance to the realm. They pledged their allegiance to King Henry and their dedication to serving him, but asserted that his evil advisors had passed the sentence of attainder against the Yorks in order to benefit from their dispossession and demise. Edward and Warwick disembarked at Sandwich in late June 1460, accompanied by 2,000 men. They commenced their march towards London, gathering supporters along their route. They were aware that King Henry was assembling his troops and reinforcing his position at Northampton, and that even then, Queen Margaret's forces were advancing on London. Margaret's army, however, had acquired a formidable reputation among the merchant class as well as the common populace. Queen Margaret, abandoned by the English people, many of whom detested and feared her, and unwilling to force entry into the capital, retreated northwards once more. On the 2nd of July, Edward and Warwick received a warm welcome into the city from London's mayor, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and other assembled dignitaries and onlookers, while the cautious and incensed Lancastrian garrison withdrew into the Tower. It appears highly improbable that deposing King Henry and seizing the throne for themselves was the objective for any of the Yorks at this juncture. It certainly does not seem to have been the case for Edward and Warwick. They reiterated that their foremost desire was solely to meet with and affirm their loyalty to the king, whom they were confident would rescind their sentences of attainder and reinstate their titles, fortunes, and inheritances that had been revoked by the accusations of treason. They then pledged to assist in restoring effective governance of the realm under King Henry. If, however, the king's counselors persisted in turning him against the House of York, his loyal subjects, they would have no alternative but to engage in conflict. A corporate loan of $1,000 was granted to Edward and Warwick by the merchants of London to compensate the soldiers who would fight in the upcoming battle. This relatively modest sum is somewhat revealing. It suggests that the people of the capital placed more trust in Edward than Queen Margaret, but likely not by a significant margin. Furthermore, it indicates that the people of London believed Edward and Warwick when they asserted they had no intention of deposing the king, for why else would they fund such an undertaking? And if they were willing and desirous to have Henry deposed, why would they not have provided the Yorks with a more substantial loan? 2 days after his arrival, Edward led his army out of London, reaching Northampton on the 9th of July. Warwick was dispatched to negotiate with the Duke of Buckingham, who displayed considerable reluctance to permit Warwick to see the king. There seemed to be no option other than to fight. Edward Warwick and Warwick's uncle, William Neville, Lord Fauconberg, each commanded one of 3 troop columns. The Yorks appeared to be facing a formidable challenge at Northampton. They were outnumbered by at least 2 to 1. The king's forces occupied a fortified position and possessed several large cannon. The Battle of Northampton was in fact the inaugural military engagement in English history in which field artillery was actually present on the battlefield. Unfortunately for the Lancastrians, the 10th of July 1460 was an exceptionally rainy day, rendering their cannon inoperable. Moreover, the vanguard, commanded by Lord Edmund Grey, defected to the Yorkist side early in the battle, swiftly shifting the momentum in favor of York. With these rather fortuitous advantages, the combat lasted little more than half an hour. The number of casualties were not reported on the York side, which may indicate that they were minimal. 300 men perished on the Lancaster side, including the Duke of Buckingham and all of the other high-ranking royalist commanders. Edward and Warwick located King Henry in his tent, having been captured and detained by a Yorkist archer. They greeted him respectfully and informed him that they had come to escort him back to London. Though he remained the king, Henry was now effectively Edward and Warwick's captive. The Yorks re-entered London in triumph on the 16th of July. After the Lancastrian garrison at the Tower surrendered, the Yorks issued writs summoning Parliament for the 7th of October, where they intended to reverse the attainders of treason imposed upon them by the Coventry meeting of June 1459. This was indeed the initial act of the Parliament that convened in October 1460. Richard, Duke of York, however, seemed recently to have cultivated considerably grander ambitions than merely regaining his former titles and properties, or settling for the position of second most powerful man in England. Documentary evidence confirms that as early as the 8th of September 1460, only 3 weeks after the writ summoning Parliament had been issued, the Duke of York had omitted King Henry's regnal year from all of his correspondence, dating all of his communications, instead using this year of grace, which was highly unconventional. When he arrived in London for the Parliament in October, he rode like a king at the forefront of his retinue, his sword drawn and held upright before him in unmistakably royal fashion, his banners proudly displaying the royal arms of England. When he strode confidently into Parliament, placed his hands upon the throne, and proclaimed himself king by virtue of his lineage from Lionel, Duke of Clarence, elder brother of King Henry VI's great-grandfather, John of Gaunt, he was met with stunned and uneasy silence. Duke Richard's claims were evidently a step too far. What is remarkable about the reaction to these proceedings is that the Parliament and its attendees were overwhelmingly pro-Yorkist. Yet they clearly still harbored no desire to revisit the instability of a usurpation, nor were they willing to retract solemn oaths of loyalty, which they had all sworn to King Henry. Edward was almost certainly present at this momentous Parliament, and one can only speculate as to his thoughts on his father's actions at that moment. But if the reactions of York's Neville relatives are any indication, it is plausible that he was as embarrassed and surprised as they, for regardless of whether they were aware of the Duke's intentions, neither Salisbury nor Warwick uttered a word or made any gesture in support of the Duke's claim. The Commons declined to deliberate on such scholarly matters of succession, deferring to the Lords to decide. Most of the power brokers present distrusted and disliked Margaret of Anjou and had clearly accepted the convenient rumors that her son, Edward of Westminster, was not King Henry's son and was therefore illegitimate. She commenced gathering her forces in the north of England, and loyal Lancastrians enthusiastically joined her army at Hull. A significant problem for the Yorkist cause was that their primary estates and possessions were situated in the north, and many of these were now being raided and plundered by the Lancastrians. In early December, the Duke of York departed for the north at the head of his army, accompanied by his son Edmund and his brother-in-law Salisbury. In the meantime, Edward was dispatched to Wales to enlist troops, and Warwick remained in London to maintain control. Subsequently, upon receiving news of his father's death at the Battle of Wakefield, Edward initially prepared to depart for London, but altered his plans to confront the advancing forces of Jasper Tudor at Mortimer's Cross. Following Edward's victory there, he became aware of the unfortunate defeats suffered by Warwick and his forces at the Second Battle of St. Albans. Warwick had sustained injuries and King Henry had been recaptured by the Lancastrians. But the city of London had once again demonstrated its Yorkist allegiance and closed its gates to Margaret of Anjou. Now that his father had died, the 18-year-old Edward was the new head of the House of York. They had control of the capital and still enjoyed considerable support within Parliament. But they had lost King Henry, who had been the central figure around which Yorkist authority had consolidated. It can be persuasively argued that Edward now considered assuming the throne himself as the only viable course of action. He had not been the one to initiate his family's pursuit of the crown, but they seemingly had to persist on this path or face annihilation. Edward almost certainly recognized, as did his family and supporters, that if they were to relinquish the throne back to King Henry, none of them were likely to survive the vengeance of Margaret of Anjou or other steadfast Lancastrians. While he had not originally intended to claim the throne, his swift and decisive actions when he deemed it necessary underscored his self-assuredness. Considering the widespread public dissatisfaction with King Henry VI's rule, coupled with the general antipathy towards his queen, perhaps Edward believed he could only improve the situation. The fact that Edward was essentially propelled to the throne due to his father's actions and the vagaries of circumstance should not imply, however, that he was displeased with becoming king, or that he hesitated in any way to wield the powers and privileges of a monarch when the opportunity presented itself. Edward's arrival in London on February 26, 1461, and the subsequent events of the next 9 days were meticulously orchestrated. Both he and Warwick were warmly greeted by the populace. One chronicler recounted a popular verse being sung in Edward's honor amongst Londoners in the days following his arrival. "Let us walk in a new vineyard, and let us make a gay garden in the month of March, with this fair white rose and herb, the Earl of March." Edward's lineage and its superiority to that of the Lancastrian usurpers was emphasized in public pronouncements. On March 3rd, the hastily assembled new Great Council convened and agreed to recognize Edward as king. On the morning of March 4th, he attended Mass at St. Paul's before proceeding to the Great Hall at Westminster. There, the Archbishop of Canterbury administered the oath to Edward. He was adorned in royal vestments, crowned with the cap of state, and assumed his position upon the king's bench, scepter in hand. Following this rather impromptu coronation, the more formal ceremony for which would follow a few months later. Through this strategy, Edward exerted significantly greater pressure on the English elite to endorse his right to rule. Furthermore, it was decreed that anyone who killed or captured and delivered a high-ranking Lancastrian enemy to King Edward would be rewarded with $100. These measures were effective to a degree, but much more remained to be done to bring England under Edward's dominion. The Yorkists controlled London in the southeast and were gradually gaining more support in the south, but Wales and the north of England remained a complex mix of Lancastrian, Yorkist, and regional loyalties, which would require further time and effort to subdue and stabilize. In addition, the general instability caused by civil war in England had emboldened the Scots to initiate raids and hostile incursions across the northern border. Edward had less than 3 weeks in London to formulate his next course of action before embarking on campaign once more. On March 13th, he left London at the head of an army bound for Yorkshire. The Battle of Towton, fought on March 29th, 1461, was the bloodiest engagement of the entire Civil War and likely the deadliest battle ever fought on English soil. Estimates of the fatalities at Towton vary from as few as 9,000 to as many as 28,000. Approximately 75% of the English peerage had at least one family member present at the battle. And based on the number of retainers each was capable of fielding, a maximum estimate of 50,000 men engaged at the height of the battle is plausible. Edward's forces were significantly outnumbered, but his characteristic approach of audacious, courageous offensives and astute utilization of every advantage ultimately routed the main Lancastrian forces. The Lancastrian armies occupied the higher ground, but the Yorkist archers exploited the harsh, bitter winds and snow blowing directly into their enemies' faces, launching a barrage of arrows into the Lancastrian ranks. Simultaneously, the strong winds and reduced visibility rendered the Lancastrian archers almost ineffective. Infuriated, they charged down the hill towards the enemy, and Edward's army surged forward to meet them. The battle raged throughout the entire day, but despite their numerical superiority, the Lancastrians were eventually defeated, and the survivors were scattered by nightfall. Towton significantly consolidated Edward's power. It precipitated the flight to Scotland of Henry VI, Margaret of Anjou, and their son, Edward of Westminster. It had decimated the English nobility and severely weakened their capacity to resist the new Yorkist regime. It had diminished the Lancastrian hold on the north of England by removing the royalist northern earls, leaving the region more accessible to Yorkist control. Although some Lancastrian loyalists had escaped, many had fled the country with the royal family. Finally, Towton had enabled Edward to achieve glory and legitimize his claim to the throne, not only by hereditary right, but also by right of conquest. Edward's reign spanned roughly 2 decades and is unique in English history. He is the only king of England to have ever gained the throne, lost it, and subsequently regained it a second time. Consequently, his reign is conventionally divided historically into 2 phases: his first reign and his second reign. Edward's rule was reinforced after his victory at Towton, but Lancastrian resistance remained a pressing concern for the following 3 years. The regions of Northumberland and Wales proved to be particularly steadfast supporters of Lancaster and difficult to subdue. Edward largely entrusted the suppression of these ongoing regional rebellions to his lieutenants, especially during his first year as king, when he was occupied with assuming the reins of government and taking control of the kingdom's legal and financial infrastructure. Edward presided over his inaugural parliament in November 1461, at which his legitimate right to the crown was proclaimed. The Lancastrian lineage was characterized as one of usurpation, and the escalating decline of the realm was emphasized. Even worse, justice remained as inconsistent, inefficient, and tainted by corruption as it had been during the Kentish Rebellion a decade prior. Edward pledged to address this disastrous situation decisively. To a considerable extent, Edward did strive to uphold these commitments. His repeated presence in the court of the King's Bench was sufficiently remarkable behavior for a king to warrant discussion among contemporary London commentators. He exhorted the leading men whom he had generously endowed with duchies and earldoms to ensure the equitable and ethical administration of justice. But in reality, local autonomy was almost absolute, and the king's control over individual regions was tenuous, maintained only by the strength of Edward's personality and the loyalty he endeavored to cultivate through generosity and magnanimity. Edward was also the pioneering monarch to introduce privatization methods to the management of royal lands and finances, although the Tudors, commencing with Henry VII, are often primarily credited for this type of innovation. The fact that Edward IV was never raised or prepared to be king largely explains his approach to royal revenues, which he managed as though they were a privately owned estate. Instead of continuing the traditional medieval practice of collecting fixed rents from tenant farmers who were typically permitted to retain any profits, Edward instead employed stewards and receivers to whom he paid wages to collect all profits. Furthermore, royal revenues were now directed to the king's personal household account rather than the royal exchequer. Edward was also the first king to invest his personal funds in various business and financial ventures, much like any merchant. Through these means, he lessened the likelihood that he would need to rely on parliamentary taxation for funding. By the midpoint of his second reign, he had succeeded in reducing the majority of England's debts, although unfortunately he had also accumulated some of his own. Edward understood that he was expected to embody the image of the magnificent medieval warrior king. He had demonstrated impressive bravery and skill on the battlefield, and now he was resolved to surpass Henry VI in every other respect as well. Edward therefore spent consistently and lavishly on fine clothing, opulent jewels, exquisite tapestries, plate, and luxurious furnishings for his palaces. He successfully projected an immensely impressive image, particularly in contrast to the notably frail, confused, and shabby King Henry at the nadir of his power. For Edward, it was essential that both his subjects and foreign dignitaries perceive him as the quintessential king. He recognized that the appearance of prosperity would make loans more readily available to the crown, and that the valuable assets he was accumulating could serve a dual purpose, as financial collateral and as a means to impress visitors. The expenditure required to maintain such magnificence meant that by the time of his death, Edward left the treasury only marginally improved from its state when he ascended the throne. Edward was barely 19 years old when he claimed the throne, and as a young man, he was sometimes more inclined to pursue his personal pleasures than to immerse himself in the daily minutiae of governance. Edward was fond of riding, hunting, jousting, and feasting and drinking with his companions. Fortunately, his fondness for food and drink did not negatively impact him as a young man, as he was highly active and athletic. Edward also maintained several mistresses during his reign, although only a few were known by name. Lady Elizabeth Lucy was Edward's mistress for many years, both before and after his marriage, and he had two illegitimate children by her whom he acknowledged, Arthur and Elizabeth. Other well-known mistresses of Edward's include the married Lady Butler, Eleanor Talbot, and Elizabeth Shore, more commonly known as Jane Shore. In the initial years of Edward's first reign, when he seemed more inclined to leisure than labor, he had a tendency to delegate numerous political responsibilities to the highest-ranking and most trusted great men within the Yorkist faction, primarily Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. For the initial years of Edward's reign, access to the king was primarily mediated through Warwick. This circumstance contributed to the firm belief among many contemporary observers, and almost certainly Warwick himself, that he, rather than Edward, was the true power behind the throne in England. His active role in the success of the Yorkist cause, in his implementation of Edward's policies and governance during the early period, had earned him the epithet the Kingmaker. Undeniably, Warwick had been central to Edward's ascension to the throne and to the strengthening of Yorkist authority during Edward's initial reign. But perhaps these realities caused Warwick, as well as certain of Edward's biographers and historians, to overlook the truth that Edward was not merely his subordinate, but very much an independent ruler, with his own distinct intellect and will. Foremost among Warwick's initial points of contention with Edward concerned the king's marital arrangements. Warwick had envisioned a distinguished royal marriage for Edward with a French princess, and he also advocated for a pro-French trade policy, which he diligently endeavored to advance. Edward's refusal to heed Warwick's counsel in these matters created a division between them, which gradually intensified throughout the latter part of the 1460s. The first major disagreement arose in the summer of 1464 when, in order to preempt any arrangement for a royal marriage, Edward abruptly declared that he had secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, the widowed Lady Grey, at her family residence several weeks prior. This event not only inconvenienced and embarrassed Warwick, who had been engaged in negotiations for a French princess on the king's behalf, but it also demonstrated that the still youthful 22-year-old Edward was considerably less compliant than Warwick had assumed. The king's marriage was met with controversy by the majority of his court. Elizabeth was not only a widow with two young sons, but her deceased husband had perished fighting for the Lancastrians. Her father, Sir Richard Rivers, was not of noble rank, but a common knight who had married Jacquetta of Luxembourg, the noble widow of the Duke of Bedford. Elizabeth, critics remarked with disdain, was no suitable partner for a king. Of greater concern to Warwick and other prominent Yorkists was the extensive family that the new queen brought with her. Her numerous siblings and subsequently her many offspring were soon engaged in betrothals with the most prestigious families that the English nobility could offer, provoking considerable envy, resentment, and apprehension that there would be significantly fewer advantageous marriages available for the children of the Yorkist peerage. Elizabeth and Edward, however, gave every indication of their happiness and evident affection for each other, despite the uproar they had generated within the court and across the nation with their unconventional and socially unequal union. It is said that Edward was immediately captivated by Elizabeth. In portraits and depictions, she appears to have possessed golden or reddish blonde hair, and one chronicler described her as the most beautiful woman in the island of Britain, noting her lovely heavy-lidded eyes. The most well-known portrait of Elizabeth Woodville, displayed at Queen's College in Cambridge, reveals a face with very refined features and what seem to be warm, light brown eyes. The painting is believed to be a replica of a portrait painted from life in 1471, but again, the specifics of her appearance, similar to those in Edward's portraiture, may not be entirely precise. Edward, a well-known womanizer, even in the best of circumstances, was reported to have propositioned Elizabeth very soon after their initial encounter, when she had petitioned him for the restitution of her husband's estates following his death. The narrative recounts that Elizabeth initially refused to yield to Edward's advances, defending her honor, quite literally, with a knife. Obsessed and unable to forget her, the young king then proposed marriage to her. What is striking about this particular royal marriage is the ease with which Edward could have simply slept with and then discarded Elizabeth. He could have readily denied or disavowed a marriage conducted in secret had he wished, especially one so disadvantageous and certain to be opposed by almost everyone. The most plausible explanation for his failure to do so was that he was in love with Elizabeth and had no desire to marry anyone else. Their marriage was fruitful, producing 10 children over a 14-year period, 8 of whom survived infancy and 5 of whom lived beyond adolescence. Nevertheless, Edward continued to maintain mistresses regularly even after marrying Elizabeth Woodville, which undoubtedly placed strain on their relationship, but which did not appear to unduly disrupt the close and joyful family life that both Edward and Elizabeth actively worked to cultivate. Edward's marriage had alienated and inconvenienced Warwick, but he was perhaps even more angered by the king's decision in 1467 to adopt a Burgundian trade policy rather than a French one. To Warwick's dismay, Edward solidified his new alliance with Duke Charles of Burgundy by giving him his sister Margaret in marriage. Warwick became increasingly sullen and resentful in the following years, and began to view Edward's younger brother George, Duke of Clarence, as a more promising substitute for the king he could not control. In 1469, Warwick and Clarence initiated the circulation of a rumor on the continent that Edward was illegitimate, with the aim of sowing seeds of doubt that might pave George's way to the throne. Despite Edward's explicit prohibitions, Warwick and Clarence secretly departed for Calais, where Warwick married his daughter Isabel to George. Subsequently, rebellions erupted in the north of England, which some historians believe were instigated by Warwick and Clarence, but which could equally have arisen from persistent economic difficulties and local corruption that the conspirators exploited for their own purposes. When Edward's forces attempted to suppress the northern rebels, they were intercepted by Warwick's forces at Edgecote Moor, where they suffered a devastating defeat. Edward subsequently fell into Warwick's custody, and in the following months, Warwick attempted to compel his abdication, or failing that, to wield power in Edward's name. However, he lacked sufficient support to bolster either his own or Clarence's authority, and was soon compelled to release his incensed king and cousin. Edward was reportedly deeply shocked and wounded by the betrayal of his brother and his cousin, 2 individuals he loved and had trusted implicitly. The years 1469–1470 must have been a period of immense stress and despair for Edward, who had to confront the errors he had made as king, the treachery of his family, and the grief and fury of his wife, whose father and brother Warwick had executed after the battle at Edgecote. At this juncture, Warwick and Clarence were running short of both options and allies, and they had little recourse but to align themselves with the exiled Lancastrians. The King of France facilitated a reconciliation between Warwick and Margaret of Anjou. Together, they planned an invasion of England and arranged the marriage between Warwick's daughter, Anne Neville, and Margaret's son, Edward of Westminster. Unfortunately, Edward was in Yorkshire addressing another rebellion when Warwick invaded the capital. Queen Elizabeth and her 3 young daughters, Elizabeth, Mary, and Cecily, sought sanctuary at Westminster Abbey, and Henry VI was released from the Tower, where he had been imprisoned since his capture in 1465 and was reinstated as king. The second reign of Henry VI was brief and tumultuous. The exceedingly discordant coalition of Lancastrians and Yorkists rendered the central government weak and ineffective. Within less than a year in exile in Holland and Flanders, respectively, Edward had amassed sufficient strength to reclaim England once more. Edward arrived in London in early April 1471, where he reconciled with his brother. George had become disillusioned with the plan to reinstate Henry VI, most likely because he perceived no personal benefit in it. His mother and sisters had secretly assured him, through clandestine communications, that if he threw himself on Edward's mercy, he would be welcomed back into the family. Edward then marched his forces out of London to confront Warwick and Margaret of Anjou. On the morning of Easter Sunday, utilizing a near impenetrable fog to his full advantage, Edward's forces triumphed over Warwick's at the Battle of Barnet. Warwick perished on the battlefield, and mere days later, Edward's armies engaged those of Margaret of Anjou at Tewkesbury, where despite their numerical superiority, Edward once again prevailed. Margaret's son, Edward of Westminster, was killed in battle, while the Lancastrian queen herself was taken captive. Edward re-entered London in triumph on May 21, 1471, He proceeded directly to Westminster to reunite with his wife and children. There, he discovered that during her time in sanctuary, Queen Elizabeth had given birth to their first son, Prince Edward. The king's joy was depicted in a contemporary poem. The king comforted the queen, his sweet baby full tenderly he did kiss. The young prince he beheld and in his arms did bear. Thus his bale turned him to bliss. After sorrow, joy, the course of the world is. The sight of his baby released part of his woe. Thus the will of God in everything done. Edward had survived his deposition, fought the concluding battles of his military career, regained the throne, and thankfully his family had remained safe. However, the brutality required to preserve his power was not yet concluded. That very night, King Henry VI was murdered in the Tower. Most historians concur that this act was most likely carried out on Edward's orders, through a forceful and rapid blow to the back of the head. While Henry's son, Edward of Westminster, was still alive, there was no strategic rationale for killing Henry, an action which would eliminate an imprisoned heir and create a new one who was already at liberty. Now that his son was dead, Henry could be safely eliminated. Some historians propose that this dark deed was executed by Edward's younger brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Intelligent, ambitious, and reportedly ruthless, Richard had remained resolutely loyal to Edward, which renders his later alleged crimes against his nephews, known to history as the princes in the Tower, all the more heinous and perplexing. Now, Edward V was truly king. His second reign, which endured for the remaining 12 years of his life, was somewhat more peaceful than the first, and the greater domestic stability allowed him to concentrate more fully on the reforms he had not completely achieved during his initial decade on the throne. Edward persisted in his efforts to improve the rule of law, making it a point to accompany officials to oversee the reform and administration of justice, particularly in regions where unrest and rebellion had been prevalent. While perhaps no medieval king could have entirely eradicated the phenomenon of local corruption, England under Edward IV at least attained a greater level of stability and institutional effectiveness than had ever been the case under Henry VI. Edward also continued to work towards making the crown financially stable once more. In addition to his innovative approach of privatizing royal lands and finances to augment revenues, Edward sometimes employed less than scrupulous methods of revenue generation. The confiscation of Lancastrian lands and properties was standard practice with any regime change, and these yielded substantial income. But the king frequently had to bestow them upon his brothers and supporters to maintain their loyalty. Edward frequently utilized benevolences, which were payments made to the king in lieu of military service. Furthermore, Edward ensured that when English coinage was revalued during his reign, he increased the minting fees on gold and silver coins, which provided him with a considerable profit. The king was also not averse to petitioning Parliament for funds under the guise of waging war, but then promptly making peace with his supposed adversaries and appropriating the parliamentary grant to augment the royal treasury. This is precisely what he did in 1475 when he initiated an invasion of France. It does not appear, however, that this was his original intention. Edward was a military man and a capable general, and undoubtedly he was drawn to the prospect of victory and martial glory in France, which would secure his renown and immortality alongside Henry V and Edward III. Edward's military commanders and the English populace more broadly, however, perceived this situation quite differently. Many were alienated by Edward's choice to avoid conflict with the French, viewing his peace-oriented strategy as an indication of timidity and a cause for national humiliation. The nobility were soon appeased by the financial benefits arising from the peace from which they directly profited. Nevertheless, Edward's wider public approval rating experienced a notable decline after 1475, and he began to acquire a reputation for being excessively desirous of wealth and possessions. Despite this shift in public perception, the outcomes of the French undertaking ensured that Edward was never again compelled to request funds from Parliament, and it guaranteed that upon his death he would not bequeath to his heir a crushing burden of debt. However, owing to his own extravagant expenditure, the royal treasury contained only approximately $1,200 in ready money at the time of Edward's passing. Even more detrimentally, Edward's relationship with his brother George deteriorated markedly in the years that followed. Edward declined to permit his brother to wed the heiress of Burgundy, as he remained apprehensive that, given sufficient power and opportunity, his brother might still challenge his claim to the throne. Resentful of this constraint, George sought to revive not only long-standing rumors alleging Edward's illegitimacy, claiming he was the bastard offspring of a common archer, but also asserted that Edward had been secretly married previously to his public wedding, and consequently all of his children were also illegitimate. He was also reported to have remunerated a seer to predict the king's demise. Far from displaying forgiveness on this occasion, Edward himself presided over George's trial for treason, and the Duke of Clarence was executed within the Tower of London on February 18, 1478. Some deliberation regarding Edward's legitimacy is warranted here, as it has become a considerable point of debate among historians in the past 2 decades. In 2002, the historian Michael K. Jones brought to light evidence he contended offered definitive proof that Edward IV was, in fact, illegitimate. The parish records of Rouen Cathedral indicate that roughly 9 months prior to Edward's birth in April 1442, during a crucial 5-week period when conception was most likely to have occurred, Richard, Duke of York, was engaged in military operations on campaign in Pontoise. However, this evidence also relies on several assumptions, none of which can be conclusively verified. Firstly, Jones assumes that Duchess Cecily remained in Rouen throughout this entire time frame, or that Duke Richard did not return at any juncture during the Pontoise campaign, neither of which can be substantiated. Furthermore, it is known that Duchess Cecily had recently suffered the loss of her second child, a son named Henry, who survived for only a few days. Cecily and Richard had journeyed from England to Rouen shortly after this child's death. The Duke and Duchess had been raised together within the same household, and while their marriage had been arranged from childhood, their relationship was as close to a genuine love match as an arranged marriage in the medieval era could realistically be. The notion that Cecily would have engaged in an adulterous affair, betraying the husband she demonstrably loved while still grieving for her recently deceased son, strains credulity somewhat. Even more improbable is the suggestion that the Duchess, who would have been constantly attended by servants in her daily life, could have engaged in something as scandalous as an affair with a common archer without any discovery. While the Rouen Cathedral Register constitutes a compelling piece of historical data, it is far from conclusive, and the majority of historians continue to accept Edward IV as being of legitimate birth. Ultimately, the rumors concerning Edward's illegitimacy first surfaced in 1469, when Warwick was attempting to install George upon the throne in Edward's stead. In the spring of 1483, Edward became gravely unwell. Observers and chroniclers offered differing accounts regarding the cause of his illness. One account suggests he had contracted a chill while fishing on the River Thames, which subsequently developed into a fever. Others asserted that he had been poisoned. Yet another proposed that the king had suffered a fit of apoplexy or a stroke. Considering Edward's lifestyle and weight gain in his later years, this latter explanation is arguably the most plausible scenario. The king survived for only 10 more days following the onset of his enigmatic illness, but this period was sufficient for him to revise his will and make arrangements for governance and stability during his son's minority. His brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was designated to be appointed Lord Protector until the 12-year-old Prince Edward reached maturity. Although he was only 40 years of age, Edward was fortunate enough to pass away in his own bed, surrounded by his family and closest companions, reassured and comforted that his son would succeed him. These were luxuries rarely granted to medieval warrior kings. Certain historians contend that Edward's legacy is not as celebrated as it merits. He was undeniably among the most accomplished military commanders ever to have occupied the English throne, having never experienced defeat in any battle where he was personally present. Yet his name is seldom invoked alongside England's most revered warrior kings, such as Henry IV or Edward III. The most probable explanation for this is that all of Edward's military triumphs were achieved against his own countrymen rather than against foreign adversaries, and numerous historians have perhaps found it challenging to extol the abilities of a man whose military brilliance resulted in the shedding of so much English blood and the destruction of the elite of English chivalry in the mid to late 15th century. Moreover, Edward's legal and financial reforms provided the structural basis for the subsequent Tudor regime, which facilitated enhanced centralization, thereby enabling England's progression towards eventually becoming Great Britain. Edward was generally well regarded by the English populace for much of his reign, as evidenced by the public displays of grief and national mourning that ensued following his death. He was, in numerous respects, a considerably more accessible king than the English people had previously experienced. He was affable, amiable, likable, forgiving, courageous, and self-assured. He was also arguably the most thoroughly English king that the realm had possessed since the Norman conquest, a characteristic that the English people, who harbored suspicion towards most foreigners, undoubtedly valued. Edward's parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents were all born and raised as Englishmen. Furthermore, Edward himself married an Englishwoman rather than a foreign princess, a practice almost unheard of among English royals. Some historians argue that Edward IV was ultimately a failure as king owing to the chaos, violence, and instability that erupted after his death, including the imprisonment of his sons, the usurpation by his brother Richard, and Richard's subsequent conflict with Henry Tudor for the throne. However, this viewpoint neglects to consider that had Edward lived longer, his children would have dominated the royal marriage market of Europe through unions with the royal families of France, Spain, Scotland, Denmark, and potentially other royal houses as well. Moreover, had Edward IV lived for a longer duration, his son would have directly succeeded to the throne, and the Tudor dynasty might never have emerged. Yet, owing to the astute and skillful negotiations undertaken by Elizabeth Woodville with Henry Tudor's mother, Margaret Beaufort, the eldest daughter of Edward IV, did, in fact, ascend to the throne. When Elizabeth of York married Henry Tudor and was crowned Queen of England, she became the originator of her father's enduring legacy, a long lineage of kings and queens of England. What are your thoughts on Edward IV? Please share them in the comments section below, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.